Now I finally caught it. I'm breathing your life inside of mine. I finally caught it. I feel it. You've got
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Lighthouse. We are on episode 10 this week. Thanks for making your way back to the channel. A little bit of a special edition as we are on the eve of 4th of July, Independence Day for our nation. It's also a transition point as we've moved out of the book of Mark and we've moved into the book of Joshua. There's a ton in the book of Joshua, and it's kind of worked out nicely. What I first landed on, not by design, plays into the theme of independence. And so we're going to look at that this week. Without further ado, let's dive in. So we're going to start in chapter 4, and just to tee up the context here, God's people, the Israelites, have been enslaved in Egypt for a very long time. They are released from their slavery in Egypt, and then they circle the wilderness for several years, 40 years before they actually make it out into the promised land. God had promised them this great land that they would eventually go into. Moses has been the leader for a long time. Moses doesn't actually take them into the promised land, though. A man by the name of Joshua actually ends up leading God's people, the nation of Israel, into this great land that he has promised them. In chapter 4, it picks up, and they're crossing over the Jordan River, which is the final journey, camping on one side, crossing over to the other to actually enter the promised land. And they're crossing through this river, and there's a moment during this crossover. It's something I think is really important and cool that happens. In the beginning of chapter 4, verse 1, it says this: "When all the people had crossed the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, 'Now choose 12 men, one from each tribe. Tell them, take 12 stones from the very place where the priests are standing in the middle of the Jordan, carry them out and pile them up at the place where you will camp tonight.'" You fast forward to verse 6, and Joshua goes back and he starts explaining to the leaders of these tribes what they're going to do, what God's asked them to do. Then he gets into why it's important. Verse 6 says, "We will use these stones to build a memorial. In the future, your children will ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' Then you can tell them, 'They remind us that the Jordan River stopped flowing when the Ark of the Lord's covenant went across. These stones will stand as a memorial among the people of Israel forever.'" Let's stop there. Just a couple verses this week. The reason I stopped here and highlighted this and what I'm processing is this concept of a memorial. God had just performed a miracle. He gave them a promise that there was a land, a great land, that he was going to provide for his people. They had to journey to get there. There was a final step where they had to cross over this Jordan River. The Jordan River, it says, was overflowing. It was high season. It was deep. It was wide. There was no way physically for the people to cross the Jordan River to reach the promised land. It took a miracle. It took God's intervention. They carried the Ark of the Covenant, which was God's presence. The priests took this ark. The minute they stepped their foot into the Jordan River, the water receded completely, and there was dry ground for the people to walk across the Jordan River into the promised land. And so what God tells people is, I don't want you to ever forget. I want you to build a memorial. I want you to take stones from the middle of this river. I want you to build a memorial on the other side, so that anytime you, your ancestors, your children, your grandchildren pass by this memorial, it will create a conversation, it will create a memory, and that memory and conversation is focused on the fact that the people were delivered to this promised land for only one reason, is because it was God's will, and it was because of God's blessing that they were there and they were able to achieve it. And God never wants his people, in this case, to ever forget it. Even the people that may not have had the opportunity to be part of that miracle, to actually physically walk across and see with their own eyes and experience that miracle, it would give them an opportunity to tell whoever witnessed this memorial of what had actually occurred. So that took place in the book of Joshua. What does that mean for me? What does that mean for you right now? Well, I found myself asking the question, what memorials have I built in my life? You got to remember, this message is not just written as a history book. It's also meant to be applied to us right here and right now. And so God is speaking to me and God's speaking to you. It's important that we look to the areas of our life where God has performed a miracle, where God has delivered us either into freedom, where God has, helped us overcome insurmountable odds, where God has delivered a ton of blessing and favor into our life, whatever it might be, there have been moments, whether we realize it or not, where God has moved in a big way to get us to where we are today. And what God's asking us to do is he's just saying simply, never forget. I want you to never forget the source of your blessing, the source of your existence is all because of me. And so he asked these men to build a physical memorial with stones. Now, we wouldn't do that today necessarily, where we would build a physical memorial based on something God has done in our life. So what would it be? Well, it could be as simple as maybe it's a change in behavior. Maybe it's a change in lifestyle. Maybe it's actually something that we used to do before that we say no to now. And that in and of itself may pose a question from one of your kids. It may pose a question from a friend. Why aren't you doing X, Y, and Z? Well, because God blessed me, and now I've chosen to live a certain way as a memorial, as a way to remain obedient, as a way to never forget what God has done in my life. It's a way to honor God. This memorial that was built for these people was an honoring way to always continue to remember what God had done. There's an opportunity for us to make memorials in our lives right now. While it may not be physical, there's ways that we can insert spiritual memorials or conceptual memorials in our life, and we can go out of our way to explain to people, go out of our way to explain to children what exactly those memorials mean to us, what happened, what occurred, and the power and blessing that came through those experiences with God. It's an extremely powerful and important thing, and I think it also ties into this concept of independence and the 4th of July that we're on the eve of here in the next couple of days. We use the 4th of July as a way to remember what our country was founded on. It was founded on freedom. It was founded on the fact that we had gained independence from where the forefathers and founding fathers came over as part of Britain's rule, and that we had declared that we were going to now be an independent and free nation. And so we remember on the 4th of July. It's a memorial for all of us for what our nation stands for. Now, there's a lot of turmoil and things going on in the nation, and so I actually found a couple of things that I wanted to talk about and quote. Now, it's a great debate around the founding fathers and the people that signed the Declaration and all of this about what their faiths were. If it was Christianity, if it was based on other things. People have debated it for years and years and years, and it'll probably be debated for years to come. But here's what I do know. There's a couple things that I found that I want to quote. One of them is from George Washington, and this was the last official address of George Washington to the legislature of the United States. This is after he had served his term. This is after that he had been president of the United States. It's after he had done so much within government. So he'd seen it all, he'd learned a ton, and this was his last address to the legislature. The quote from George Washington is, "I now make it my earnest prayer that God would most graciously be pleased to dispose us all to do justice, to love mercy, and to demean ourselves with that charity, humility, and pacific temper of the mind, which were the characteristics of the divine author of our blessed religion." Now, I think it's important about this quote from George Washington, regardless of what you may think about his beliefs and anything else that he has done, is that his last address, which is his kind of final last words, if you will, go back to prayer. They go back to God being a foundational piece of our life, God being a foundational part of our country. And what he's asking for is that God, he's praying that God would impart on all of us living here as a member of the United States, a citizen of the United States, that we would simply not only strive for justice and strive for peace and mercy and humility, but that we would actually pick up the characteristics of the divine author, which is God himself. And that's coming straight from the first president of the United States. There's another article that was written in Forbes, and again, a media outlet that doesn't really have any regard necessarily or tie to the church. This was an article written in 2012. The article was titled, "Was America Founded as a Christian Nation?" And it goes through a lot about the debate of different points of view about our founding fathers and whether some were tied to Christianity, some weren't. Was God and Christianity tied into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, or was it not? And you get all kinds of different opinions all over the place. But here's what the contributing editor from Forbes wrote in this article. The founders disagreed on much, but were nearly unanimous concerning biblical morality. They understood the relationship between state and society differently than progressive thinkers today. Government cannot mold man. Righteous men must mold government, which requires the inculcation of virtue through vibrant churches. And simply what he's saying is the government structure, the laws, everything that we have today doesn't make people righteous. It doesn't make people good. It's good people that really end up impacting and affecting what the government does. And so I think it's a perfect marriage between what we see in Joshua about memorials and independence and freedom all being based on a miracle from God and God's will, to our first president of the United States and his last words to the legislature, talking about his prayer to God that we would adopt the divine author's characteristics and that should be what governs our life, to this editor in Forbes writing an article talking about the fact that, laws don't make righteous people, that righteous people need to be there to affect and put the right laws into place. All in all, I'm going to go into this 4th of July, regardless of everything that's happening, and try to remember and try to build memorial that God is at the center of everything that we have. God will continue to be. He needs to be. We need to continue to put him first. Our country is hurting right now, and we need answers, and we need closure. We need healing. And the only person that can bring that healing is God himself, and that's where all of our attention and all of our prayers need to be directed. I hope you have a great 4th of July. Hope you enjoyed episode 10, and we'll see you back here next week for episode 11.